Hello, and welcome to the Scott Mize Show, a podcast focused on health, diet, bodybuilding, and philosophy. I interview experts, doctors, coaches, and N=1 case studies to answer your questions about improving health, achieving your best physique, and making sustainable progress. We'll cover topics from carnivore and ketogenic diets to bodybuilding to life philosophy and everything in between. Enjoy the show. This episode is brought to you by LMNT Electrolytes. This month, we're switching it up with an exclusive offer that's only for VIP LMNT partners, including Carnivore Cast listeners. You can now receive this free sample pack along with any regular purchase when you use my custom link, which is provided in the show notes or my Instagram link in bio. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, all one word. And as I said, I'll include the link in the show notes. LMNT Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious, and get yours today to help support the show. Thank you. This is a quick disclaimer before we start the show. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said here should be taken as medical advice, and please consult with your physician before making any changes to your diet, exercise regime, or medications. Thank you, and on to the show. Paul Austin is a prominent figure in psychedelic and has guided millions to safe and meaningful psychedelic experiences through his work as the founder of Third Wave. He's been featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and BBC's Worklife. He's pioneering the convergence of psychedelics, personal transformation, and professional success. Paul empowers leaders, creatives, and pioneers to leverage psychedelics for profound personal and professional growth. He views psychedelics as refined skills cultivated through mentorship, exploration, and purposeful use, critical for humanity's ongoing evolution. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hey, Scott. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, really excited to chat with you. And I'd love to just start with your background. How did you get involved with psychedelics and helping people through psychedelic journeys?
Yeah, so my story begins in West Michigan. I grew up in a suburb of Grand Rapids, which is a small city in West Michigan, the second biggest city, known for its furniture, more recently beer. Amway is from Grand Rapids. It's a small conservative city in the Midwest, and I grew up in a pretty religious family. Not fundamentalist and not necessarily not fundamentalist and not overly conservative. My mom and dad are both Democrats and progressive, but like a very sort of structured and rigid household where every Sunday I was at church for 3 to 4 hours. And in that sort of environment, drugs were obviously looked down upon and not seen as something that, kids or adults would really engage with. And at the age of 16, I started to explore cannabis and tried it a few times. And soon after that, my parents found out, unfortunately. And they sat me down one Sunday after church, and my dad looked at me, and my dad's a very kind, sweet man. But he looked at me and was like, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident, 35 years prior, right? So my parents were totally sort of blown away by the fact that I would smoke weed. They couldn't believe it. And that was in large part because of their, conditioning, because of how they had been educated in the 70s and 80s around drugs. And also because my mom's sister had been a drug addict. And so there was this sort of negative connotation related to illegal drugs. And as many of us know now, there's a substantial difference between, let's say, weed and cocaine or weed and heroin. And they didn't really have that nuanced perspective. And so at the age of 16, it was very clear that these experiences I was interested were no longer acceptable or okay to talk about. And yet that, didn't really stop me, because a few years later, I was in college, and that same friend who introduced me to cannabis ended up asking me if I wanted to try magic mushrooms. And we ended up trying it, just him, myself, and one other friend. And it was like an interesting experience. It wasn't a profound breakthrough necessarily. I did a couple grams of mushrooms at that point in time, but it did open the door to learning more about psychedelics. And a few months after that, I tried LSD for the first time. And LSD was, my drug, I guess, my medicine. It really helped me to open up, to be aware of things that I hadn't been aware of previously. And at that point in my life, I was 19, 20 when I started to experiment with these higher doses of psychedelics. I was at a point in time when I was trying to figure out who I was, what I was going to do professionally, what my goals and sort of ambitions were personally and professionally. And those early psychedelic experiences opened me up to the fact that I could live in a way that was unconventional. I didn't have to follow necessarily the same path that everyone else followed. And so that led me down, a path of becoming a digital nomad. I moved to Turkey when I was 21, where I taught English. Soon after that, I lived in Thailand,
Wow.
Portugal, Budapest, really all over the place, building an online business, which was a teaching English business. And in 2015, I was living in Budapest and was there with a couple friends, and we were just chatting about how, it looks like cannabis is becoming more acceptable. More and more states are legalizing it. We noticed that there was more research coming out about psychedelics from institutions like Johns Hopkins and NYU. And then folks like Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan were starting to interview guests about psychedelics on their podcast. So it really seemed like psychedelics would follow in the footsteps of cannabis. And at that point in time, I made a decision to, basically start Third Wave as an educational platform to help everyone learn about the pros and cons of psychedelics, not necessarily rooted in drug war propaganda, but instead rooted in science and history and best practices. And so that really just opened up my world in a new way. Since 2017, I've been fully focused on the psychedelic ecosystem. I sold my other company in 2017. And at that point in time, I really started to see the potential opportunity here, not only from a business perspective, but also to help people with mental health, to help people with leadership, performance, creativity. And it all sort of, at least in this part of the story, it all coalesced or came to a really interesting endpoint when in 2018, Michael Pollan's book came out. And you may have some listeners who at least, watched the Netflix series or even read the book. And that book was a #1 New York Times bestseller. It's called How to Change Your Mind. It really changed the mainstream perspective around psychedelics. And I sent that book to my dad for him to read and check out. And from that, he ended up beginning a microdosing protocol. And about a year after that, I guided him through a high dose psilocybin journey. And so we went from, at the age of 16, my parents being sort of shocked and disappointed at my cannabis use to, about 12 years after that, I ended up guiding my dad through a high dose psilocybin journey. So that to me just spoke to the power of these medicines, how to educate around them, and what impact they can have on, especially like our friends and family who may be struggling or just looking for a new perspective in life.
Carnivore and ketogenic diets can be an excellent way to combat diseases we commonly associate with aging and degeneration in the modern world. But if you're like me, you want to do everything possible to stay in your prime physically and mentally as long as you can, especially with me thinking about starting a family. I really value the most research-backed ingredients and science for bettering the aging process. Today's sponsor is Neurohacker, which packs 7 of the most science-backed senolytic ingredients into one formula called Qualia Senolytic. And you can take it just 2 days a month for fast and noticeable benefits and for a much better aging process. I've been taking Qualia Senolytic for the last month, and I've already noticed a big improvement in my physical and mental energy for my family and friends, and my productivity has improved. I feel invigorated, I feel enthusiastic, and ready to get things done. It's also backed by a 100-day money-back guarantee, so that means you can try it for almost 3 full months, and if you don't like it, there's no risk. You can decide for yourself. If you're in your late 20s or older, adding Qualia Senolytic to your diet can play a crucial role in combating negative aging symptoms. Go to neurohacker.com/Scott for up to 50% off Qualia Senolytic. And as a listener of the show, you can use code Scott at checkout for an extra 15% off your first purchase. Again, it's risk-free. Just go to neurohacker.com/Scott to try Qualia Senolytic with code Scott and start aging on your own terms. Thanks, and back to the show. It's funny. I grew up in pretty much the same type of household, pretty liberal, but my parents had this like complete aversion to drugs. And it's really interesting how that's shifted too. I've seen them shift. They now, are both regular users of cannabis and mushrooms and get a lot of benefits from them. But yeah, it's crazy how strong that post-war 70s, 80s propaganda was.
Yeah, and we live in a different time and an era now, with the internet and education at our fingertips. But we have to keep in mind that in the 70s and 80s, most people got their information from, we could say, the government or really big institutions. And just by the fact of that, it was much, like as we've experienced today, these big institutions are more and more corrupted by pharmaceutical companies and big oil and even big agriculture. And so the shift over the last 10 or 20 years is actually diversifying our media sources, which has opened up so many potential possibilities, especially as we relate to previously illegal drugs like psychedelics. And I think psychedelics in particular, because of their 60s and 70s, it's such a huge shift for people to go from, oh, I thought this is just what hippies and ravers and dropouts did, to no, this could actually be a really phenomenal tool in my toolkit to address depression and addiction and PTSD, but also just to live in a way that's like a bit more aligned with how we want to live.
Yeah. And how do you think that's evolving? Like, how do you think the perception of psychedelics is evolving, and what still hasn't changed?
Great question. So 61% of Americans now support legal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, which I think is huge. So the majority of Americans now support legal access to psychedelics within a therapeutic container. This research was done by Cal Berkeley. Another fun stat is in the last 4 years, the number of people who have tried a psychedelic has quadrupled. So if you look at the stats from 2019 to 2023, and I think this is partly because of COVID and the lockdowns that ensued and, a lot of the challenges in mental health at that point in time, we've seen the overall use of psychedelics quadruple, which is fantastic. So at this point in time, we have a majority that supports legal psychedelics. And as we all know, there's a difference between what the people want and what the regulators and policymakers make happen. And so already we've seen quite a bit of progress when it comes to policy. So the state of Colorado has legalized all plant medicines: ayahuasca, psilocybin, San Pedro, iboga. The state of Oregon has legalized psilocybin mushrooms. You can go to Oregon today. You can book a retreat there and legally work with psilocybin mushrooms. And California is actually looking to pass a similar bill this year, which would be huge. It's the sixth biggest economy in the world. 30 some million people live in California. So that would be a fantastic next step. And so that's tracking similar to cannabis, how when cannabis became medically available and then recreationally available, it really was on a state by state basis. In fact, cannabis is still federally illegal. It's still a Schedule I substance, according to the federal government. And psychedelics, I think, will be different because we haven't seen any progress really on the federal level for cannabis. Sure, we saw the Hemp Act, which legalized CBD, but CBD is not psychoactive necessarily. And so this year we should see the approval of MDMA by the FDA. MDMA is also commonly called ecstasy, and it's a Schedule I substance. So Schedule I means there's no medical use, and it's highly addictive, highly dangerous. And so, which the irony of our scheduling subsystem is that tobacco, which is one of the most commonly used drugs, is actually highly addictive and has no medical use. And yet it's legal and available for everyone. So what we should see this year is a rescheduling of MDMA from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, which means that it can be prescribed for certain conditions, like ketamine is currently prescribed for certain conditions. And that's going to open the doorway for the FDA to likely approve, I would say, another 2 or 3 psychedelics by 2030. So in the next 5 years. So my expectation is that within 5 to 6 years, the majority of Americans will have legal access to psychedelics, which is super exciting. I'd say the challenge at this point in time is it's really about public education, because a lot of people now, they've heard about psychedelics, they maybe heard that there's research on it, they heard that it could have some benefits, but they don't necessarily know who's a great provider to go to, or where's a great retreat to attend. They don't necessarily know the differences between MDMA and ketamine and psilocybin. So we've made a lot of progress in the sort of general perspective around psychedelics, but there's still a level of nuance that's lacking when it comes to because there's a lot of psychedelics. It's not like psychedelics are just one drug. There's mushrooms, which is different than ayahuasca, which is different than iboga, which is much different than ketamine. And ketamine's quite a bit different than MDMA, even in terms of the fact that like ketamine is a 90-minute to 2 hour session. MDMA can be closer to 5 to 6 hours. There's often therapeutic support provided along with it. So I think the next big opportunity, I suppose, to help people use these with more skill is just helping them understand the nuances between the different drugs, helping them understand the legal landscape in terms of what's currently legal versus what might be legal in the future. And then even navigating, microdosing versus high doses. A lot of the clinical research is on therapeutic doses of psychedelics, which are often very high doses, but a lot of people are actively microdosing as a way to do this on a day-to-day basis. And so even the nuance around that conversation around, well, is microdosing effective? Are there certain health risks when it comes to taking low doses of psychedelics consistently? So I think the biggest challenge or the biggest gap still is this convergence of public education with just more research and understanding about how these substances impact our bodies, they impact our brains. These are important questions that we have some context on, because again, we've been using these substances for thousands of years. These aren't necessarily new. And 2024 is a very different context than, Jesus's time around the, whatever the turn of the AD to, what was it, BC to AD. So I think the different contexts and the different approaches require more education and more research so we know where we're going.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk about, I'd love to get into, we can talk about like some of the research and stuff like that. But before that, I'd just love to talk about your experience, because I think there's so much value in the on the ground, for lack of a better term, clinical or experiential data you've gathered from helping thousands of people. What are some of the benefits you've seen, ways people enhance their performance, their well-being, their life with psychedelics?
So, where I've been very fortunate is that I've done a lot of work both in the microdosing aspect. I wrote a book called Mastering Microdosing. We've had courses that folks have gone through. I probably coached or educated, probably like 10,000 people indirectly or directly at this point in time. So there's a lot of interesting anecdotes and benefits that I would say are specific to microdosing. And I've also had a great opportunity to guide at this point over 1,500 people through high dose psilocybin experiences. So I've been able to look at what are the differences between that high dose and the microdose. When is a high dose appropriate versus a microdosing protocol? And this is all part of what I call the skill of psychedelics.
What is considered a high dose?
A high dose,
how you're using it?
Yeah, I would say for mushrooms, a high dose would be anywhere from 2 grams to 5 grams,
Okay.
even upwards of 8 grams, depending on the individual and
Yeah.
their sensitivity and things like that. Whereas a microdose would be 100 milligrams, maybe 200 milligrams. It could be up to 500 milligrams. So it's about a tenth of a regular dose. And the metaphor that I often talk about when it relates to microdosing versus high dosing is the metaphor of a dentist. Like, every 6 months we go in, we get a really deep clean to keep our teeth and our gums and our mouth super healthy. And then every day we brush our teeth. Twice a day we brush our teeth, we floss, we take care of it. And so I think this relationship between high doses and microdosing is every now and then a high dose of a psychedelic can be really effective as a reset instead of a sort of oral hygienic reset. I think of it more as a spiritual or just holistic reset. And then in between those high dose experiences, it's really helpful to have practices, non psychedelic practices like meditation and breath work and yoga, hot cold thermogenesis. It could be changes to diet, exercise, and sleep, right? The whole key with psychedelics is they open a window of neuroplasticity. And so it can be really useful to take advantage of that window of neuroplasticity to weave in new behavioral patterns that help us just generally to show up with more energy, with a better mood, with more presence. So I think that high dose therapeutic level is great as that holistic reset. And the research supports this, that for the months after a high dose of psychedelics, people feel like they have a better mood, they have more energy, the relationships are healthier, they eat healthier, they exercise more, they sleep better, right? There's a lot of positive benefits. The challenge, of course, is unless you actually change things in your day-to-day life, the long-term benefits of psychedelics will dissipate. And so that's what I mean with behavioral change, that it's great to have the high dose psychedelic experience, but oftentimes what happens in that high dose psychedelic experience is we get downloads or insights about things that we should shift or change in our lives to be healthier. That could be we quit smoking, that could be we drink less alcohol, that could be we have a difficult conversation with our partner or spouse or loved one, but it's really essential that there's work done on the back end. And that's where microdosing, I think, can be really useful and effective. That when we take these low doses of psychedelics, maybe 2 or 3 times a week for a month or 2 months after a high dose therapeutic experience, it keeps open that window of neuroplasticity for a longer period of time. So
Interesting.
there's just a longer range to, I think even they say with new habits, it takes a minimum of 30 days to establish a new habit. I would say
Yeah.
sometimes as long as 45 to 60 days. So I'm really looking at what's that convergence of habit development. What's a great habit or two that we can commit to after a high dose psychedelic experience? And how can microdosing make it as easy as possible to do that over the span of 30 to 45 to 60 days? And so
Cool.
kind of just to land this fully, if I could communicate sort of the two main benefits that people have, it would be the impact of psychedelics on neuroplasticity. So, how can psychedelics help our brains become more malleable? Because when that plasticity is higher, it's easier for the brain to shift and change. So, that's number one is neuroplasticity. And number two is the impact on courage. And so, a lot of what holds us back in our healing process or our transformational process, whether it's leadership or performance or well being, is the kind of cojones to make difficult decisions or to have difficult conversations. And
Interesting.
so psychedelics, because of their impact on the amygdala, which is sort of the fear response center in the brain, they down regulate that fear response. People notice that in the day or week or 2 weeks after a psychedelic experience, or even while microdosing, there's less resistance to doing the difficult thing that we know is going to make our life, our business, our relationships better. And
Yeah.
so I
That
think
fear.
rooting in those two outcomes is often helpful for folks to get a sense of, oh, this is how it might, benefit my day-to-day life.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like how you articulated that. That's super interesting. Yeah, I think that like most people are living with that day-to-day hesitation or fear to do the things that are really important to them. Um, sometimes it's like procrastination about work. Sometimes it's the fear of making a social, taking a social action, reaching out to a friend, talking to someone. And yeah, I've definitely seen with myself and obviously heard a lot about how psychedelics can help with that.
Well, and I think partly that's because of like the ego and our personal
Mm,
identity, right? And
yes.
the ego, there's a lot of like, kill the ego, dissolve the ego, get rid of the ego. And I do think a healthy ego is a healthy aspect of our personality, especially in the West. We do place a lot of emphasis on the individual and individual sovereignty and individual freedom. So having a healthy ego is useful. The
Yeah.
challenge is that when the challenge is because of trauma or because of the way things have happened in the past and emotionally impacted us, there are ways that we act in the present moment that just don't need to be there. They're just old patterns, they're old stories, it's old wounding. And so when we have a psychedelic experience, that allows us to be fully present in the moment and not have our actions and behaviors dictated by some of the challenges that we've faced or some of the trauma that we've confronted at an earlier age. And so the ego wants to stay the same. The ego wants, it's comfortable, it's safe. And so psychedelics are a great sort of forcing mechanism to get us beyond that and actually look at, okay, yeah, the status quo is fine, but how could my life be even that much better and healthier and richer?
Okay. And yeah, so I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the research you mentioned, or we were discussing before we hopped on, and you mentioned some of the research around VHD and some of the concerns around psychedelics and comparing them to other medications on the 2B receptor,
Correct.
5-HT2B. Can you
Correct.
explain that for folks? Like break it down first, what the concern is, and then maybe your thoughts on it?
For sure. So we have a lot of longitudinal data on occasional high dose psychedelic use. Meaning, if you do a high dose of mushrooms or a high dose of LSD, or even drink ayahuasca, like once a month, let's say as an extreme, it's physiologically very safe and healthy. Um, Usually people aren't doing it more than once every, let's say, 3 to 6 months, as I sort of communicated through that dentist metaphor. But even at once a month, it's quite safe and healthy over the long term. What we don't yet have a lot of clinical research on is what happens if we take low doses of psychedelics consistently over a long period of time. Microdosing as a approach to psychedelics is fairly new. It's only been, talked about for the last 10 years. And it's only been commonly sort of practiced probably for the last 5 years. So we don't have a lot of longitudinal data on what happens if you take, a microdose of LSD or a microdose of mushrooms every day for the rest of your life. As an example, we do have some of that data on SSRIs and benzodiazepines, antipsychotics. It doesn't look good necessarily, but we at least have the data to know what happens. We don't necessarily have that with low doses of psychedelics. And so what's interesting about psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms is that they're very active on the serotonin system in our brain and in our gut and in our body. And one of the aspects around serotonin is this 5-HT2B receptor, which, if activated too often or too intensely, can create valvular heart issues, disease, conditions. This is most commonly known from I believe it was a diet pill that was prescribed in the early 90s called Fenphen, Fenphen, that
Okay.
was put on the market. And I think after maybe 6 months or 12 months, it was taken off the market because people noticed that, oh, I'm taking this diet pill consistently and it's creating these heart issues.
Mhm.
And so as microdosing was talked about and started to come into more people's awareness, I started to hear about this potential issue about 7 years ago. There was this theoretical potential that psychedelics, because of their activity on the 5-HT2B receptor, which isn't, it's not the majority of their activity. The majority of the activity of classic psychedelics is on the 5-HT2A receptor, not the 2B receptor.
Okay.
But there's still some affinity for the 2B receptor. And so there was a fear that if people did this every day for years, that it could create valvular heart issues. And so usually, and the jury's out. We still don't know. We still don't have the clinical research. If I'm honest, again, I've coached thousands of people through this process. Not once have I heard of this being a challenge or a promise or a challenge or an issue for folks who are doing this. And the sort of safety mechanism, and this is built into microdosing protocols as well, is if you rest, 2 or 3 weeks between protocols, it ensures that there won't be any long-term issues. And so that's what we teach and educate around microdosing. We communicate that this is a protocol. We communicate that it might be done 2 or 3 times a week for a month or 2 months. Usually I tell people to go no longer than 3 months with a microdosing protocol. And that it's really important that you weave in breaks. So after you do an initial protocol, take 2 or 3 weeks off, allow your whole entire system to rest. I mean, this is even advised for caffeine or for cannabis or for really any drug or substance. As you know, Scott, it's good not to have obviously physiological dependency is terrible, but even psychological dependency on any external drug is not great. And so I think as long as folks are reasonable with how often they microdose, then there won't be any of these health conditions. I think that the caveat here, Scott, is that a lot of people who are microdosing are weaning off SSRIs. And so they've been conditioned into thinking they need to take a pill every day to feel better. And so what we emphasize with microdosing is not a magic pill, that it's a catalyst, that because of its activation of the 5-HT2A receptor, it's related, as we talked about before, to neuroplasticity. So that the key with undertaking a microdosing protocol is to actually weave in new behaviors that support, a healthy lifestyle in the long term, that you're not just looking to take a microdose for the rest of your life to feel better, but that you're actually taking action to eat better, to move more, to sleep more, to meditate more often. And that is the key to actual long sustainable change where we can feel great on a much long-term basis.
Got it. Yeah. Speaking about reasonable use, the reason I became aware of this research is because my father sent it to me, and maybe you can just talk about how this might not be responsible. The way he uses psilocybin and THC, he's like a very health conscious guy, and he's like, I'm very afraid of building up a tolerance, both to THC and psychedelics. So the way he does it is once or twice a month, he'll take 5 grams of mushrooms and like 50 milligrams of THC to combat the nausea.
And
he's like, I want to really feel the effects. And, he has a great time, but he lives with both him and my mom live with chronic pain. They both have osteoarthritis. And so I tell them, like, why don't you just use THC like a normal person would, like every day, every other day, to help with the pain? And they're like, no, I really don't want to build up a tolerance. So their alternative is doing these mega doses like once or twice a month.
Right. So, I mean, what I would say on that is, if I was talking to your dad, and probably I am, because he probably will end up listening to this.
Yeah, he'll definitely listen to this.
What I would say to Scott's dad is, probably get some blood work done still, like just have check-ins with your doctor to see how it's going and what it's like. Listen to your body. It sounds like they found an approach that works for them, which is useful. And if they're noticing benefits from it, then great. And of course, it's always helpful to have, the blood work to look at and other things just to double check. Okay, like I'm noticing X levels are going down or Y levels are going up. And that's a very healthy thing. I think, with that level, right? 5 grams of mushrooms and 50 milligrams of THC, physiologically, I would be less concerned than psychologically. But my bet is your parents are kind of OGs, and the sort of psychological intensity of that is reasonable for them to navigate and handle. Yeah. And then the other thing that I would point your dad towards is there was some research that came out on low doses of LSD maybe 3 or 4 years ago that showed that they were just as effective, if not more effective, than opiates for pain management.
Interesting.
And so that might be as you said, the doing the low doses too often can build up tolerance. But what I've noticed with coaching people, and what we've noticed from a lot of the anecdotal reports, is as long as it's no more than twice a week, and as long as you're cycling to some degree, then there really won't be any buildup of tolerance.
Oh, interesting.
And this is true for all supplements, right? Not just microdoses. Sure. Like, I take this supplement called Qualia, which is a nootropic from Neurohacker. Fantastic, and I'm good friends with the CEO. They sponsor the show. Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. All right. So,
it's a great plug.
So James is a dear friend, their CEO, and I was hanging out with him a few months ago, and he's like, you should cycle all supplements, right? All supplements need to be cycled. This is not the case just for microdosing, because the body, he described it as the body is not used to getting consistent nutrients or consistent, minerals or vitamins, right? We're biologically much more used to, feast and famine, if you will. So that cycling is important. And then if your dad was interested or your parents were interested in trying it, I would just say, see how it impacts your day-to-day pain. If it's helpful for that day-to-day pain, there's no physiological sort of addictive aspect of psychedelics, as your dad is probably aware of. So the key would just be that cycling. And again, as long as it's only twice a week and there's breaks that are taken every now and then, I don't think there would be much to worry about as it relates to tolerance buildup.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Yeah. It's super interesting how different drugs affect tolerances and people differently. But there are some universalities, like you mentioned, the need for cycling and things like that.
Well, and even like the other interesting research about psychedelics, and we probably have parents that are around the same age, I would imagine late 60s, early 70s. Yeah. As we get much older, it takes a lot more of a psychedelic to impact us. And this is especially true for anyone who's over the age of 60. So even the 5 grams of mushrooms for your dad and 50 milligrams of THC, the way that I would experience that might be closer to 2 grams of mushrooms and 20 milligrams of THC, depending on my sensitivity. And so that's where it's like the individual sensitivity is really, it's what I found is the 2 biggest variables are age and then previous history of SSRI use. If someone has a previous history of SSRI use, they also tend to need quite a bit more to like, kind of punch through the numbing that they've experienced for however long they were on the SSRI.
Interesting. Obviously it's not medical advice, but when you work with individuals on SSRIs, do you try to work with their doctors to wean them off before guiding them through psychedelics?
That's a really important question, because, you had asked the question earlier in the show about what are still the gaps or, the unknowns, or what are people still worried or concerned about? And I think this is one of the core things, which is what are there contraindications between certain psychedelics and certain psychiatric medications? And so what I defer to is psilocybin is the safest of all of the psychedelics if you are on a psychiatric medication. MDMA is a no-go for a lot of people who are on SSRIs because it can cause serotonin syndrome, which you do not want. Ketamine is safer than MDMA and legally available, but there's still some contraindications. Psilocybin, the only thing that psilocybin is contraindicated with is lithium. And that lithium is most commonly prescribed for things related to schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, which is already a contraindication for psychedelics. Anyone who has a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia should not be touching a psychedelic, especially if they're under the age of 26.
And when you say lithium, you mean like medical doses of lithium, not like
correct.
The supplement doses
correct.
that some people would take in like
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good clarification, Scott, because I have lithium, I think, in one of my supplements that I take here and there,
Yeah.
but it's not a medical dose of it. So if someone
Yeah.
is on a medical dose of lithium. So recent research is, there's been a couple interesting research papers that have been published, one very recently, the other one a few years ago, which showed that, first of all, SSRIs are perfectly safe to take if you are microdosing or if you're doing a high dose of psychedelic. Maybe the other way to phrase that is, if you are on an SSRI, it is safe to take psilocybin mushrooms. You still want to do so with the support or under the guidance of a medical professional, but it is safe. The other interesting research that came out showed that people who tried to go cold turkey on their SSRIs, like a week or 2 weeks prior to a psilocybin experience, actually had a less beneficial experience with psychedelics because the withdrawal symptoms were so severe that it substantially impacted the quality of the experience. So usually what I tell folks is, if you're on an SSRI and you want an immediate sort of boost and impact, just go and work with a high dose of psychedelic or a high dose of psilocybin. Don't immediately work about weaning off or trying to go cold turkey before you do it. Okay. And also look at microdosing. You can microdose while you're on SSRIs, and there are medical professionals that I know that I even work with and collaborate with if I have clients who are navigating this. That there are certain microdosing protocols that you can take while on SSRIs that will help you wean off those SSRIs. But as anyone listening to this may know, if they've been on an SSRI, that can be a long process. You know, it can be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, even depending on how long they've been on an SSRI. But it's important to know that taking psilocybin is safe if you are on one. And as I mentioned before, do so with the support and guidance of a medical professional. That is, I think, imperative.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very good, thorough answer. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is there have been a handful of studies on the effectiveness of microdosing, like whether people notice an effect, how it affects cognition, how it affects mood. And the one in particular, which is apparently the biggest self-blinding study in 2021, self-blinding citizen science to explore psychedelic microdosing, found basically that there wasn't a difference between the control group and groups with LSD of 5 micrograms, 10 micrograms, or 20 micrograms every fourth day over 3 weeks. So curious, like, how you interpret some of the research on microdosing. I know other studies have found like significant effects. So just curious how you think about that.
Yeah, so it's still early days, right, for a lot of the research on microdosing because it's such a new way that people are approaching it. And so there's been, the quality of research is often dictated by budget. It's dictated by, I would say budget is probably the biggest one, that a lot of the early research on microdosing, including the one that you just mentioned, was done on an extremely low budget in an attempt to generate some context and awareness of if and how microdosing was impacting people. So in the research study that you mentioned, there wasn't really any way to control for the amount that people were taking. It was not clear if it was, because a lot of it was just sourced illegally from various places. A lot of people didn't necessarily go through what I call a calibration phase, which is they're attempting to find what's a sweet spot when it comes to microdosing. That's often a big indicator and a big factor, kind of like what we were talking about with your dad. Your dad gets a lot of efficacy from 5 grams of mushrooms and 50 milligrams of THC. If I took that, I would be in another dimension, in another universe, that have no idea what's going on, right? And so that's also true with microdosing, that we need to find dose levels that are appropriate for folks, and that may require some coaching or it may require some professional support to do that.
Yeah.
And so there's been, I would say, and I track all of this research religiously. I'm very much aware of what's out there. There's been literally one research trial at this point that has actually studied research in the way that it's been used anecdotally. And it's a really interesting study. And it's actually being carried out in New Zealand, because the way that they're doing the study would not be possible in the United States. And in New Zealand, they've just completed a phase 2 clinical trial. So the phase 2, there's 3 phases in total. Phase 2 is I think a control or a group of about 80 people in total. And because they did the research in New Zealand, the New Zealand government allowed people to take home the microdose with them. All the other research up until that point in time that had been done in a clinical environment was you take a low dose of a psychedelic, you go into a room, you do these different tests, you figure it out, and then you leave and go home. And as you and I both know, if you take a microdose in a laboratory setting where you're having to do tests all day, the chances of you having an interesting and beneficial experience compared to taking acid and going for a hike in the woods or meditating somewhere or whatever it is, that's night and day difference. And so what was so incredible about this research trial in New Zealand is people could take home that 10 micrograms of LSD with them. They could do it twice a week in their normal everyday life. And the results they found were pretty phenomenal. 53% of the participants no longer qualified for depression. Wow. There was a 60% reduction in overall symptoms of depression across the entire group. And interestingly enough, the individuals who were microdosing with LSD on average got 20 more minutes of REM sleep each night. Wow. Which was sort of like a weird and unexpected benefit. And as we all know, listening to this podcast, sleep is the foundation of all good health, all Absolutely. Good mental health, all good overall wellness, right? And then there were, they noticed that people had more energy, they had a better mood. And that research is being carried out by a company called Mind Biotherapeutics. It's a for-profit biotech, publicly traded company on the Canadian Stock Exchange. And they're looking to bring to market a microdose of LSD for depression. And so that's right now, for me, that's the gold standard, right? That's what I refer to. And then a lot of the other research that's out there, almost all of it has been done what we would call observational design, meaning it's not double-blind placebo-controlled. There weren't tightly regulated mechanisms or measures. It's more about what's happening just out in the field. And some of that research shows efficacy. Some of that research does not show efficacy, like the one that you mentioned. But the ones that have the one research trial at this point in time that's actually done it what I would consider to be the correct way has shown clinically significant outcomes. And so my expectation is that within probably 4 to 5 years, there will be a prescribable form of LSD to treat depression, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's incredible. That's going to help so many people. Exactly. Well, Paul, this has been fascinating. Really enjoyed getting to know you and
Thank you, Scott.
Hopefully asking you some different questions. But I learned a ton, and I'm all more excited to dive into some of your work and research. Where can people find that and follow you? And I'll have links to everything in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so a great first step is my book, Mastering Microdosing, which is on Amazon. That's really easy to pick up. The main website to check out is The Third Wave. You could just type in Third Wave into Google, thethirdwave.co. We have a newsletter. We have a free community platform that folks can join to ask questions and connect with others who are also interested in psychedelics and microdosing for healing and transformation. And then we also have a practitioner training program. So if someone is listening to this and they're a coach or a therapist or a doctor, or they want to become more professionally involved in the psychedelic ecosystem, we also have a training for coaches and practitioners in the psychedelics and microdosing space. And you can find out details about that on thethirdwave.co. And then I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. I'm pretty active. That's Paul Austin 3W. If folks are listening to this, they have questions, they just want to reach out and say hi. I check my DMs. And would love to hear from any and all listeners who, maybe learned a new thing or two from the episode together.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. Really enjoyed it and hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can find The Scott Mize Show on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please leave a comment, like, review, or share the podcast with your friends or followers. It helps more people find the show.